Learning occurs in many ways: reading, writing, observing, and doing. Montgomery College's access to history is for the doers. Our guests have participated in actions or events that we now recognize as part of history. In the studio, they sit down, mic up, and have conversations with faculty and students from Montgomery College. There is no host, no flashy set, and no commercials, just people and their stories. Sometimes the stories date back many years, and sometimes the story is current. It's all historical, and it's part of Montgomery College's access to history.
In this rare episode of Access to History, we leave the studio for the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center, where student veterans who are part of Montgomery College's Combat to College program got up close to aircraft that made history. They also spent time with retired Air Force Colonel Joe Kinego, who recorded over 900 hours piloting the famed Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird in military reconnaissance missions all over the world during the Cold War. Traveling up to 17 miles above the Earth at over 3 times the speed of sound, foreign powers tried to shoot down the Blackbird, but none were successful. Colonel Kinego's presentation to the students during this visit contained information that at one time was top secret. U.S. military veterans now enrolled at Montgomery College were given a unique opportunity as part of the Combat to College program. They were taken to the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center near Dulles Airport in Chantilly, Virginia. The center is a companion facility to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum located along the National Mall in downtown Washington. Home to about 200 aircraft and 150 large space artifacts, the building's hangar-style floor area is as big as a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. Some of the most famous aircraft to have ever flown are here. At the center of the entire facility is a plane unlike any other. It's painted black, with a cartoon skunk on its tail. Although it's a military plane, it carries no missiles or bombs. Its weapons are primarily cameras and incredible speed. It's the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. Retired Air Force Colonel Joe Kinego was one of its pilots. On this day, he took the students in for a presentation that told its story.
First of all, welcome to the Udvar Hazy Center. I want to congratulate you and thank you all for your service. I know you are returning veterans, I understand, and all enrolling in college, and that's just absolutely fantastic. I have always been a big believer that the military is a great place to get a start, and then after that, when you kind of have a little bit of a feeling as to what you want to do with your life, to go ahead and start your college education. So congratulations to all of you for that. A lot of people think that the SR-71 was developed as a result of Gary Powers being shot down in his U-2 on May 1st, 1960. And as you'll see as we go through the dates, that's not actually true. It's not untrue, but it's not a true fact. There's more to it than just that. July 5th, 1955 56 was the first Soviet Union overflight by a U-2 aircraft done by the Central Intelligence Agency. Two important things during the Cold War, and you all are familiar with the Cold War, I'm sure, to some extent. The Soviet Union was a closed society. We needed to know what was going on in there with their weapons development, with their missile development. What were they doing? We felt the only way to really do that was overfly the Soviet Union.
The U-2 he refers to is the Lockheed U-2, a high-altitude reconnaissance plane developed by aeronautical engineer Kelly Johnson. The U-2 was designed to fly above 70,000 feet, safe from the range of the Soviet MiG-17, their best interceptors at the time, and safe from Soviet radar and missile defense systems. Or so it was believed.
First flight was in July 5th, 1956. Two very important things happened at that point. The first one was they found out, our intelligence experts and our scientists found out that the information that the U-2 brought back was second to none. It was fantastic. It was exactly what they were looking for. Great pictures. They could see the missiles. They could see what was going on in the Soviet Union. They could see the military bases very well. That was the good news. The bad news was that the Soviets knew the U-2 was there. They could see it on the radar. They could track the U-2. They knew it was there. So our scientists at that point felt that probably 4 to 5 years before Soviet missile technology caught up to the U-2. And boy, they hit that one pretty much right on the head, because it wasn't but 4 years later that Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union in his U-2, May 1st, 1960. Following that, in 1962, when President Eisenhower worked with Khrushchev to get Powers back, there were no more manned overflights of the Soviet Union. So the U-2 didn't overfly the Soviet Union anymore. The SR-71 never overflew the Soviet Union. You'll hear a lot of people say, oh yeah, the SR-71 was overflying the Soviet Union. Never happened, because Khrushchev said in 1962 that he'd release Powers as long as we didn't stop all the manned overflights of the Soviet Union. We agreed to that, so we didn't do that anymore, but that's the time that the satellites were back online and we had unmanned vehicles that were being able to do the same sort of thing.
So between 1957 and 58, well before CIA pilot Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, Project Gusto was launched to develop a successor to the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft.
This is a handwritten note that Kelly Johnson did, probably at the Lockheed cafeteria in Burbank. And you see up here it says, basically, redesign of the U-3. At that point he was calling it not a U-2 but a U-3. He didn't know what to call it. That led to the A-12 ox cart. This is the CIA version of the SR-71. It's very much like an SR-71. You put them next to each other, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It's about 7 feet shorter than an SR-71. But this is the first airplane that the contract was billed for, and this was in 1959. It was May of 1960 when Powers was shot down. So the actual contract to build these aircraft was prior to the shoot down of Powers in the U-2. So that's the point I was making there, that it was after the U-2's first flight, but prior to the shoot down, that this whole development process started.
The A-12 ox cart had a small radar cross-section, about 1 square meter, and in the early days of radar, it would appear on the enemy's scopes only once or twice before its incredible speed got it out of range. Because this was before the advent of computers, the design of the aircraft was done entirely using a slide rule. The A-12 was America's first stealth aircraft. During flight, extreme heat was caused by air friction and the aircraft's engines. Due to this, 93% of the aircraft is constructed with titanium alloy. Titanium is lightweight. It can withstand extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, and it gets stronger during these conditions.
I will tell you, sitting right there where I sat, in a pressure suit, so I've got the pressure suit on with the gloves, and I've got about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of glass, and I could put my hand against the cockpit window for about 8 seconds before I had to pull it away because it got that hot. Now I was comfortable in the cockpit because we could pressurize the cockpit and I could cool the cockpit, and I was in a pressure suit so I could cool myself up also. But if you touch the surface like I did, about 8 seconds before you have to pull your hand away.
But having titanium as its primary construction material presented one key obstacle.
The United States had no source of titanium back in the late 50s and the early 60s. The only country that did, and this was during the Cold War, of course, was the Soviet Union. So the Central Intelligence Agency opened basically a storefront in Maryland, an international business that then opened a storefront in Europe as an international business, and then went into the Soviet Union and bought titanium, and that had shipped back to Europe, at which time they then shipped it to Southern California, where they used it to build the SR-71 that then flew in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The heat required special fuels. We used the fuel to cool the aircraft, actually. Special hydraulic fluids. Hydraulic fluid also has a consistency of molasses. You have to heat it before you can actually run it through the engines and all. So there's a lot that goes into getting the airplane ready to fly, but that's all as a result of the heat.
Heat created by the aircraft cruising at around 90,000 feet above the Earth at Mach 3.2, which is about 2,100 or 2,200 miles per hour, or 36 or 37 miles a minute. If it was possible to fire a high-powered rifle like the .30-06 from coast to coast and maintain its muzzle velocity, the Blackbird would arrive about 5 minutes before the bullet.
We always had a joke that you didn't know there's nothing like being lost at 3 times the speed of sound because you're really getting lost quickly.
The obvious main source for all this speed: the 2 massive engines.
Pratt & Whitney J58 gets continuous afterburning engine, which was unheard of at the time and still is one of the state-of-the-art things. At Mach 3 and above, 80% of my power was basically a ramjet, which meant that engine and the inlet system associated with it was actually pulling us through the air as opposed to the engine pushing us through the air. So you save a lot of fuel by doing that. I mean, we burnt an awful lot of fuel in the SR-71, don't get me wrong, but the airplane became more fuel efficient the faster you flew. This is an engine on a test stand and an engine run. And the way you could tell if it was operating on all cylinders and everything was burning perfectly was 13 of these diamonds. If there were 13 diamonds and they would count them, the engine would be operating actually at its max capacity, and that's how they'd shut it down and we'd all go away. The sonic boom on all airplanes comes off of the nose. And then when the sonic boom comes off of the nose and the air is disrupted, you want the air to hit all the other surfaces basically straight on, like a regular airplane flying at 25 or 35,000 feet. If you look at it, look at the engine. These engine spikes that are out in the front, they are cantered down and in. That's so that the air coming off here hits them directly. Everything was built to make the airplane precise and efficient at that altitude, but in doing that, the airplane has no square corners. So without square corners, very little radar reflectivity going back. So unbeknownst to them, or maybe beknownst because they were all professional engineers, they built an airplane that had a very low radar cross-section just because of the way they wanted to make it fly. Then they put the black paint on it, which absorbs some of that radar energy, and they mixed some carbon in the bottom of the airplane here to misdirect some of the other radar. So as a result, very little radar cross-section on the SR-71. Now in the cockpit, I could tell if I was being tracked by radar, I could tell if they locked on, and I could tell if they launched a missile. You can tell all that in the cockpit just through lights. People ask me, have I ever seen a missile? I never saw a missile in flight. I had several missions where I actually saw launch lights in the cockpit. I looked out, but I did not myself see a missile, but we've had guys see a missile. SA-2 missiles, which back when I was flying, could fly 75 over 80,000 feet, no problem. Now, they kind of go ballistic up there, but they're up there with you. They don't actually chase you, they just come up and hit you. But the problem is, you're going so fast, they would actually have to shoot that missile off the launcher long before you got into the range of the missile or the range of the radar that actually guides that particular missile. So they have to know exactly where you're going to be. No SR-71 was ever hit with a missile.
The term Blackbird referred to the family of aircraft designed and built by Lockheed's Advanced Development Programs Division, more commonly known as Skunk Works. The Skunk Works logo can be seen on the vertical stabilizers of the SR-71 located in the museum. There were a total of 4 different aircraft in the Blackbird family. 50 Blackbirds in total were built. Of those 50, 13 were A-12s and 32 were SR-71s. Aeronautical engineer Kelly Johnson was the primary designer of these aircraft.
Back during the Cold War, unlike budget scenarios now, back during the Cold War, if you had an idea and you were a smart engineer that the Department of Defense and the government respected, like Kelly Johnson, money was no problem. So every time Kelly had an idea for something else to develop here in this Blackbird family, he had all kinds of money. He delivered the SR-71. How many times do you hear this? He delivered the SR-71 several months early and many $1 million below budget. And he actually gave money back to the government for the SR-71. Oxcart, very quickly, the first flight of the CIA aircraft was in 1962, Area 51. You've always heard those mythical stories. Yes, there is really an Area 51. I've been there several times. What they would do is they'd build these airplanes in California. They'd drive them over the mountains, and then they would take them up into the desert, the Area 51, and they'd put them together and fly them. If you go to Area 51, for whatever reason, and I never had to do this because when I went out there, because of the position I was in and what I was doing, but they will foggle you. It's called foggling. When you get off the airplane, you put on glasses, and the glasses are set up so that you can see down. So when you're walking along, you can see about 3 feet in front of you, but you can't see anything else. So when you're going from building to building and you're walking outside, you'll put on these foggles so you can't see what's going on. The important date is May 29, 1967. Operations began at Kinego Air Base, Japan. This is in the A-12 now, flown by the CIA. The first SR-71, to put it in the time perspective, the first SR-71 had already been delivered to the Air Force. So there was a lot going on at this point. The A-12s were delivered to the CIA. They were going through checkouts. The Air Force wants to get on board, so they put out a contract to build SR-71. So SR-71s are being built, actually, and have been delivered to the Air Force before the A-12 by the CIA flies its first operational mission over Vietnam by the CIA. So in the fall of 1967, the A-12 and the SR-71 have a fly-off. Back in those days, you could say it right now, you could not pick a name like this. That was called Pretty Girl, was the name of the fly-off that they gave it to. And they basically flew the A-12s and the SR-71s against each other, taking pictures and comparing all the different sensor takes and sensor actions. And between the two of those, the Air Force's SR-71 model did get the go-ahead. In 1966, the SR was first delivered to the Air Force. In March of 1968, the first SR-71 operational mission was flown, also out of Kinego Air Base, Japan. At that point, they had CIA A-12s there and Air Force SR-71s there. And then when the SR-71 was successful, they started flying the A-12s home. Everything was very classified in those days, so people watching didn't know that there were two different airplanes operating out of there. They didn't know one was an A-12 and one was an SR-71. And in 1968, the A-12 program was terminated.
The SR-71 was the final design of the Blackbird family of aircraft. It could travel at speeds of Mach 3.2, although Mach 3.3 could be reached if necessary. Its maximum altitude was 85,000 feet.
At those altitudes, you can see the curvature of the Earth, about 350 miles. At those speeds, you fly faster than the Earth rotates. During the day, the sky is a deep, deep blue, not quite black. You can see the different shades of blue as you're looking down into the black. I was flying a mission over the North Pole once, and because of the way the Earth is shaped and longitude and latitudes up there, got over the North Pole. I had about an 18-minute transit to go all the way across the pole. And in 18 minutes, I had a full moon rise over my right shoulder in the cockpit and set to the left 3 complete times. The moon just went around the cockpit like that 3 complete times. It was absolutely the most amazing thing I had ever seen.
At over 80,000 feet and speeds exceeding Mach 3, SR-71 pilots have ejected. In fact, every Air Force crew member who ejected from one survived.
some of the records that the airplane has set. The important thing about these records, set a lot of records. These all still stand today, but the important thing about these records I like to bring up is we did this every day. We set these records because the country was set. We had the records and the crews were there to make sure that everything was done correctly. But that's how we flew every day in the airplane. We had no subsonic missions. We took off subsonic. We refueled subsonic behind a tanker, and then we went supersonic. And we just stayed supersonic the whole time, and then we came down. I want to just take a minute here and just tell you some of the missions we flew in the SR-71. It was a Cold War. Some of the fun missions we flew, and as veterans, my very first mission out of Okinawa, Japan, was over North Vietnam. And we had cameras on board and all, but the weather didn't matter, where normally the weather did matter and you wanted a clear day and you delay sometimes and all, but the mission was over North Vietnam, and it was primarily to go over the Hanoi Hilton. The SR-71, because I told you the sonic boom coming over the nose of the airplane here creates that sonic boom, and then these spikes right here, they create a second sonic boom. So when the SR-71 flies overhead, you get a very distinct boom boom. Don't ask me why it's that distinct and why it's that separated, I really don't know, but it's not like it's a boom boom, very distinct, double sonic boom. And when you go through the sound barrier, and when I'm taking tours around here, a lot of people don't realize that when you break the sound barrier in an airplane and you go supersonic, that supersonic sonic boom follows you everywhere you fly. So it's not just a one-time occurrence when you go through the speed of sound. So if you broke the sonic boom over Los Angeles, the people in LA would hear a sonic boom, but all the way across country, every place you flew over, Kansas, Colorado, wherever, people on the ground would hear that sonic boom. And the same with the SR-71, they'd hear a double sonic boom everywhere you go. So it's not just a one-time event. Everybody hears a sonic boom.
You hear it?
No, you don't hear anything in the cockpit. Nor is it like the movies you see where you start to shake and your teeth go back and everything. You kind of get down there and you feel what is kind of like a pause, but it's not in the aircraft so much, it's in the instruments, because the instruments pause and then boom, they go supersonic, and then they all pick up where they left off. So you don't get any shaking and rattling and anything like that. But anyway, so the purpose of this mission was to fly over the Hanoi Hilton where our POWs were being kept, so that they would hear that very distinctive double sonic boom, to let them know that people were thinking about them. So that was one mission we flew, one type of mission we flew. Another type of mission we flew, which was very much fun, was over Cuba, and with the explicit approval of the Department of State. And that was primarily when they knew that Fidel was going to be out there having a big parade, or it was a Cuban holiday, and they were going to be marching all the troops by and waving and doing all those things that they do. We'd fly right down the middle of Cuba, right when the parade was hitting stage center, and give them that big double sonic boom, so that they'd hear it on the ground. And then the other types of missions we flew were more of the standard missions, where we flew reconnaissance missions against the Soviet Union, against China, North Vietnam, North Korea, all those types of things, where we're collecting photo imagery and electrical intelligence.
The SR-71 carried numerous sensors. Among them were high-resolution cameras, side-looking radar, ELINT, or electrical intelligence recorders, and COMINT, or communication intelligence recorders.
Now, we had a good comment recorder on board, but it was funny because we flew so fast, you couldn't catch a lot of a conversation that people were having. But that proved to be very good for the electrical intelligence recorders, because we could fly by a Soviet new radar that was out there that our intelligence people thought was on board. And if they turned that radar on, even for a couple of seconds, and turned it off, we had traveled such a distance that not only could we collect the radar waves from it, but we'd travel far enough to give a little bit of a triangulation, so that they could actually see not only what it was, but where it was. We had an astro-inertial navigation system on board. It tracked 3 stars, not unlike Star Trek. We had a star date. We promised the president, because of the sensitivity to our missions, that we would never be more than 300 feet off the center line of the mission track we were supposed to fly. And that astro-inertial tracker would keep us that. The reason we did that is like our flights along the Soviet and Chinese border. Back in those days, I don't know what they do now, but in those days, the Soviets declared a supremacy out to 15 miles that they owned out there. We said we gave them out to 3 miles, international law. So our missions were at the 3-mile point along the borders. That's why we'd get a lot of reactions from the Soviets, airplanes coming out, trying to come up and intercept, doing those types of things. The rules of engagement that we had was that if you got a launch light in the cockpit, you push the throttles forward to accelerate to maximum Mach, which was 3.2. So in this case, you'd accelerate from Mach 3.0 to Mach 3.2. Not a big deal, but a little bit of acceleration. And then the second technical thing we would do is look out the window to see if you see a missile. That's what the checklist said. And then if you saw a missile, what you didn't do was try to fly the airplane to avoid the missile, because they felt you were more likely to lose the airplane trying to juke around up there than the missile was to hit you.
After the presentation, the student veterans left the conference room and Colonel Kinego took them on a brief tour of the museum.
Okay, this is Enola Gay. This is the airplane that dropped the first nuclear weapon on Hiroshima. And a lot of people ask me, is this a mock-up? Is this the real airplane? This is the real airplane. That wingtip to the far wingtip is about 142 feet. That's over 20 feet longer than the first flight that the Wright brothers made when they developed the airplane. Right in the very front, it had this very new development called the Norden Bombsight. The Norden Bombsight in World War II was completely state-of-the-art. It allowed the bombardier to put crosshairs on the target that they wanted to drop on, and then lock on, and the airplane would actually fly, and the airplane would actually drop the bombs. The space shuttle we're going to see here is Discovery. Discovery is the workhorse of the fleet. There were 135 shuttle launches, and Discovery flew 39 of them. One of the better views you get of it is from right here. That's where the crew sits. The flight deck is up there. The crew lives down here. That's the cargo bay. Cargo bay is 60 feet long. You can put a school bus in there, a Winnebago. That engine, if you recall, got its fuel only from main fuel tank. So when the main fuel tank was gone, that engine never burned again. So when the shuttle re-entered, came back to land, it had no power. It was a glider coming back in.
Main gear touchdown.
Here is the SR-71. Most airplanes have fuel tanks, and then they have bladders that sit in the fuel tanks that the fuel goes in. Back in the day when they were building this airplane, there was no technology like that would keep those bladders from melting. So there's no bladders. So the fuel goes in the fuel tank, but just sits right against the skin of the airplane. And you have those expansion joints, so because of that, the fuel did leak out. You know, people ask me, what did it feel like to fly at that speed and altitude? Well, the answer is it didn't feel like anything. I'm sitting so far forward, I can't turn my head far enough to actually see the airplane. So I don't see any airplane. So I'm in the pressure suit breathing 100% oxygen, so I don't smell an airplane. And I'm in that pressure suit with the air blowing in my head. I don't hear an airplane. So it's like going 36 miles a minute on a telephone pole, and it's very smooth.
For student participants in Montgomery College's Combat to College program, it was an experience unlike any provided in a classroom. Spending time with a retired Air Force colonel who piloted one of the most famous planes in history, and walking through a museum that gives them access to history.
Being in the military, you get to work alongside of modern technology, but here you actually get to see the history of all that technology and what you worked with and how it got there. So it's really cool, it's interesting.
My first semester here at Montgomery College, I did a report on Hiroshima, and then to see the Enola Gay, it kind of brought back the feelings of me first coming back to school as an adult, and it's just spectacular. I don't think without Combat to College, I would not be doing as well as I am in school.
The Combat to College program is fantastic for veterans, especially when they're coming from a very structured lifestyle and then just kind of transitioning and integrating back into a quote-unquote normal society. It's one of the only schools that I've seen or spoken to that actually help veterans with that issue. It's just kind of a way for that veteran to kind of feel appreciated for his service when the college wants to do these type of activities.